The spring of 1429 witnessed one of history's most astonishing military reversals. A teenage peasant girl, claiming divine guidance, led a small French force to break a siege that had lasted 7 months and seemed destined to end in English victory. Within a single week, Joan of Arc transformed the siege of Orléans from a symbol of French despair into a triumphant demonstration of how leadership, morale, and tactical audacity could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. This is the story of how faith, strategy, and desperate courage combined to change the course of the 100 Years' War. The dark hour before dawn. By 1429, France stood on the precipice of complete collapse. The 100 Years' War, that generations-long conflict between the French and English crowns over dynastic succession and territorial control, had reached its most desperate phase for the French. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had effectively disinherited the French Dauphin Charles, recognizing the English King Henry V as heir to the French throne. When Henry V died in 1422, his infant son, Henry VI, was proclaimed King of both England and France, with powerful English nobles and their Burgundian allies controlling vast swaths of French territory. The city of Orléans represented far more than a strategic crossroads on the Loire River. It was the key to the entire south of France. If Orléans fell, the road to Bourges lay open, and with it the last vestiges of the Dauphin's authority. The city was the gateway that, if lost, would deliver all of southern France into English hands. The English commander, Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, understood this perfectly when he began the siege in October 1428. The siege itself was unconventional. Rather than completely surrounding the city with a continuous wall of troops, the English constructed a ring of fortified positions called bastilles around Orléans. These fortifications, roughly a dozen in number, were positioned at key points to control access roads and the river. The English and their Burgundian allies numbered somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 troops initially, though reinforcements would arrive periodically. This was insufficient to completely seal off a city of Orléans' size, but the strategic positioning of these bastilles made it extremely difficult to resupply the city or break the siege. Inside Orléans, the situation grew increasingly dire as winter turned to spring. The garrison, commanded by Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, fought valiantly, but could do little more than hold their walls and launch occasional sorties. Supply convoys attempting to reach the city were intercepted. The citizens faced the prospect of slow starvation. French relief attempts had been feeble and ineffective. The psychological weight of the siege pressed down on defenders and civilians alike. Hope was a commodity in shorter supply than food. The broader military situation looked equally bleak. In February 1429, a French relief force escorting a supply convoy was routed at the Battle of the Herrings, so named because the supplies included barrels of fish for the Lenten season. This defeat seemed to seal Orléans' fate. The French commanders appeared paralyzed, unable to coordinate an effective response. The Dauphin's court at Chinon was consumed by factional intrigue and defeatism. Some advisors counseled retreat to the south, perhaps even fleeing to Spain or Scotland. It was into this atmosphere of despair that a 17-year-old peasant girl arrived, claiming that divine voices had commanded her to save France. The unlikely savior, Joan of Arc's rise from obscurity to military command, remains one of history's most extraordinary stories. Born around 1412 in the village of Domremy, on the border between France and the Duchy of Bar, Jeanne d'Arc, as she was known in French, grew up in a region devastated by the ongoing war. Her family were prosperous peasants, but the constant threat of raids and the general chaos of war defined her childhood. Beginning around age 13, Joan claimed to experience visions and hear voices that she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she said, instructed her that she had a divine mission to save France and ensure the Dauphin's coronation at Reims, the traditional site of French royal consecrations. For years, she kept these experiences private, but as she matured, the urgency of her mission grew impossible to ignore. In May 1428, Joan traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and approached the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, requesting an escort to the Dauphin's court. Baudricourt dismissed her, as did most people who heard her story. But Joan persisted. She returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429, and this time the political and military situation had deteriorated so dramatically that even the most fantastic solution deserved consideration. Local supporters provided her with male clothing for the journey, and Baudricourt, perhaps sensing he had nothing to lose, granted her an escort. The 11-day journey to Chinon was dangerous, requiring travel through enemy-controlled territory. Joan and her small escort made the journey successfully, arriving in early March 1429. At Chinon, she faced perhaps her greatest test, convincing the Dauphin Charles and his court that she was genuinely sent by God and not a madwoman, heretic, or English spy. Charles VII, as he would later be known, was a weak and indecisive figure, plagued by doubts about his own legitimacy. Some whispered that he was illegitimate, not the true son of the previous king. The famous story of their first meeting, where Charles allegedly hid among his courtiers but Joan identified him anyway, may be embellished, but it captures the improbable nature of their relationship. A peasant girl, wearing men's clothing and claiming divine authority, managed to convince a desperate prince to give her a chance. Before Charles would commit, Joan underwent weeks of examination by theologians at Poitiers. They interrogated her about her visions, her faith, and her mission. Remarkably, they found nothing heretical in her claims. With no good options remaining, Charles decided to gamble on this strange young woman who radiated absolute confidence in her divine mission. He provided her with armor, a household of attendants, and most importantly, attached her to a relief expedition being organized for Orléans. It's crucial to understand that Joan was not given supreme military command. She was assigned as a figurehead, a banner to rally troops around, while experienced commanders like Jean de Dunois, Gilles de Rais, Jean de Brosse, and Étienne de Vignol, known as La Hire, would handle actual military operations. The plan was to use Joan's inspirational presence to boost morale while the professionals made the real decisions. What no one anticipated was that Joan would refuse to be merely a symbolic presence. The relief force assembles. The French relief force that gathered at Blois in late April 1429 was modest by the standards of the war, but represented a substantial commitment of the Dauphin's limited resources. The force numbered approximately 3,000 to 4,000 men, including men-at-arms, archers, and foot soldiers. Crucially, it also included a massive supply convoy of food, weapons, and other necessities for the besieged city. Joan arrived at Blois on April 25th and immediately began imposing her will on the expedition in unexpected ways. She insisted that all the soldiers confess their sins and attend Mass. She demanded that the camp followers, including prostitutes who typically accompanied medieval armies, be sent away. She forbade swearing and looting. These demands were extraordinary and met with resistance from hardened soldiers who had fought for years without such restrictions. Yet something about Joan's absolute conviction had an effect. Her presence did boost morale in measurable ways. Soldiers who had grown cynical after repeated defeats found themselves inspired by this young woman who showed no doubt whatsoever that God would grant them victory. She commissioned a banner showing Jesus, Mary, and angels with the words Jesus Maria inscribed on it. This banner, which she carried into battle rather than wielding a sword, became a rallying point for French troops. The commanders, meanwhile, developed their strategy. The original plan was to approach Orléans from the south, crossing the Loire River to the east of the city and entering through the unblocked southern gates. This route would avoid most of the English bastilles, which were concentrated to the north and west. It was a cautious plan, designed to get supplies into the city with minimal risk of confronting the English in open battle. Joan, however, expressed frustration with this approach. She had not come to sneak supplies into Orléans, but to drive the English away entirely. The tension between Joan's aggressive instincts and the commander's more cautious professional judgment would define the coming campaign. On April 27th, the relief force departed Blois, marching along the south bank of the Loire toward Orléans. Joan rode at the front of the column, her banner flying, surrounded by priests singing hymns. It was an unusual military procession, more like a religious pilgrimage than an army on campaign. The soldiers, inspired by Joan's confidence and the religious atmosphere she had created, marched with better spirits than they had felt in months. The force reached a point opposite Orléans on April 28th. The plan was to ferry the supplies across the river into the city, but the wind was blowing the wrong direction, making the crossing difficult. Joan assured everyone that the wind would change, and according to multiple witnesses, it did shift, allowing the supply boats to cross. Whether this was divine intervention, fortunate timing, or Joan's intuitive understanding of local weather patterns, the incident reinforced the belief among the soldiers that God was indeed on their side. Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, crossed from the city to meet with the relief force. He explained that most of the army should return to Blois to fetch more supplies, while Joan could enter the city to rally the defenders. Joan was furious at this suggestion, seeing it as another example of excessive caution, but she ultimately agreed to enter the city with a small escort, while the main force withdrew. On the evening of April 29th, Joan of Arc entered Orléans through the Burgundy Gate. The reception she received was extraordinary. Despite the late hour, crowds of citizens poured into the streets to see the Maid, as she was called. They pressed forward to touch her horse, her armor, even her banner. The psychological impact of her arrival cannot be overstated. Here was someone who radiated absolute certainty that God would deliver them from their enemies. For a population that had endured 7 months of siege and constant fear, Joan's arrival was like a burst of sunlight through storm clouds. The English, observing this from their bastilles, hurled insults and threats across the walls. Joan, in turn, sent them letters demanding their surrender and departure from France. The English response was predictably contemptuous. They called her a cowherd and worse. But some English soldiers, particularly those of common origin, felt a superstitious dread. Rumors had reached them about this witch or saint, depending on one's perspective, who claimed God's mandate. Medieval soldiers were deeply religious and could not simply dismiss such claims. The stage was now set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of Orléans, and perhaps all of France. The first strikes. The main French force returned to Orléans on May 4th, this time entering from the north and reinforcing the garrison. With the combined forces now assembled in the city, the total French strength was probably around 5,000 to 6,000 troops, when including the existing garrison. This was still significantly outnumbered by the English forces, if one counted all their troops distributed among the various bastilles, but concentration of force would prove decisive. Joan advocated for immediate aggressive action. The professional commanders, while inspired by her presence, still preferred a more methodical approach. They decided on a compromise. Attack the English Bastille systematically, starting with those on the south bank of the river, which were more isolated from potential English reinforcements. On the morning of May 4th, the French launched their assault on the Bastille of Saint-Lô, an English fortification east of the city. Joan participated in the attack, her presence on the battlefield electrifying the French troops. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Medieval siege warfare was brutal, close-quarters work involving scaling ladders, hand-to-hand combat, and little mercy for the defeated. The assault on Saint-Lô succeeded after several hours of intense fighting. The garrison was overwhelmed, with most of the defenders killed, and the fortification captured. This was the first clear French victory in the siege, and it had tremendous psychological impact. The supposedly invincible English could be beaten. Joan had promised victory, and victory had come. Joan herself was distressed by the slaughter of the English garrison, even those who had surrendered. Medieval warfare was extraordinarily brutal, and quarter was often not given, but Joan's religious sensibility was troubled by the killing even of enemies. This human response to the horror of war, recorded by witnesses, provides a glimpse of Joan as more than just a military figure. The English response to the loss of Saint-Lô was surprisingly muted. They reinforced their remaining positions, but did not launch an immediate counterattack. The English commander, Sir John Talbot, was cautious, perhaps unsettled by the French's newfound aggressiveness and the reports about this young woman who seemed to have transformed the French army's fighting spirit. On May 5th, which was Ascension Day, a religious holiday, Joan insisted there should be no fighting. She spent the day in prayer and sent another letter to the English demanding their surrender. The English response was again mocking, but there were signs of uncertainty in their ranks. The French used the day to rest, attend religious services, and prepare for the next assault. The French commanders met to plan their next move. Joan argued for an immediate attack on the English bastilles south of the river, particularly the fortress of Les Tourelles that guarded the southern end of the bridge into Orléans. Les Tourelles was the strongest English position, a fortified gateway that controlled access to the bridge. Capturing it would allow the French to attack the English positions north of the river without the constraints of crossing the Loire. The commanders were hesitant. Les Tourelles was heavily fortified and defended by some of the best English troops under the command of Sir William Glasdale. A failed assault could devastate morale and perhaps doom the city, but Joan's certainty was absolute. God had told her, she said, that they would succeed. Her confidence, combined with the momentum from the victory at Saint-Lô, swayed opinion towards aggression. The turning point, the battle for Les Tourelles. May 6th saw the French launch assaults on two English bastilles south of the river, the Bastille of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and the more formidable Bastille of the Augustins. These fortifications were in close proximity to Les Tourelles and had to be taken before the main fortress could be assaulted. The attack on Saint-Jean-le-Blanc found it already abandoned by the English, who had withdrawn to consolidate their forces at the Augustins and Les Tourelles. The French then turned their attention to the Augustins, launching a fierce assault in the afternoon. The fighting was intense, with Joan again in the thick of the action, holding her banner and rallying troops. The French took heavy casualties, but eventually overran the fortification. The English survivors retreated across the bridge to Les Tourelles. The French now controlled the southern approaches to the bridge, but Les Tourelles itself remained impregnable. It was a substantial fortress with thick stone walls, well supplied and defended by several hundred English soldiers who knew that this was a critical position. The bridge itself had been partially destroyed, with a gap that separated the city's end of the bridge from the English-controlled portion and Les Tourelles. This gap had been spanned by a makeshift drawbridge that the English could raise or lower. The French commanders wanted to rest and consolidate their gains, but Joan insisted they attack Les Tourelles immediately on May 7th. The commanders reluctantly agreed, though some, including Jean de Dunois, apparently made preparations for an alternate assault elsewhere to split the English response. The assault on Les Tourelles began early on May 7th and would become one of the most famous battles of the entire 100 Years' War. French troops launched wave after wave against the fortress, trying to scale the walls with ladders while under withering arrow fire and bombardment from the defenders. Joan was at the front of the assault, holding her banner, urging the soldiers forward even as men fell all around her. The battle raged for hours with no clear progress. Then, in the early afternoon, Joan was struck by an arrow that pierced between her neck and shoulder, penetrating several inches into her flesh. She was carried from the battle, and the arrow was removed. According to witnesses, Joan wept from pain and fear, showing her human vulnerability. Some suggested the wound should be treated with magic charms, but Joan refused, accepting only ordinary medical treatment. With Joan wounded and withdrawn from the battle, French morale began to waver. The assault was flagging, and the commanders considered calling off the attack. The defenders of Les Tourelles had held firm all day, and darkness was approaching. A failed assault would be a devastating blow to the momentum the French had gained. But Joan, after having her wound bandaged, insisted on returning to the battle. Despite the pain, she took up her banner again and rode back to the front lines. Her reappearance had an electric effect on the French troops. If the Maid, wounded and bleeding, would not give up, how could they? Joan rallied the troops for one more assault. According to the accounts, she planted her banner near the walls and called on the soldiers to make one final push. The French surged forward with renewed energy. At the same time, a force from within Orléans managed to span the gap in the bridge with a makeshift connection, allowing them to attack Les Tourelles from a different angle. The English defense finally cracked under this two-pronged assault. The walls were scaled, and French troops poured into the fortress. The English commander, William Glasdale, fell into the river while trying to retreat across a makeshift bridge and drowned in the weight of his armor. The English garrison was overrun, with most killed or captured. Les Tourelles, the key to the English siege, had fallen. The psychological impact of this victory was immense. The supposedly invincible English had suffered a major defeat. Joan's prophecy that they would succeed had been proven right, even when she was wounded and the situation seemed hopeless. For the French, divine favor seemed confirmed. For the English, doubt began to creep in. The English retreat. On the morning of May 8th, the English faced a critical decision. With Les Tourelles lost, their position had become strategically untenable. They still held their bastilles north of the city, but they could no longer effectively maintain the siege. The Loire crossing was now controlled by the French, making resupply and coordination of their scattered fortifications extremely difficult. The English commanders, including Sir John Talbot and Lord Scales, organized their remaining forces into a battle formation in the open fields north of Orléans. This was both a defensive measure and a challenge. If the French wanted to attack them in open battle, the English were ready. They still believed in the superiority of English longbowmen and men-at-arms in open combat. The set-piece battle had long been England's preferred mode of fighting in this war. Inside Orléans, the French commanders debated their response. Joan wanted to attack immediately, but the more experienced military men counseled caution. The English position was strong, and attacking them in the open would negate many of the advantages the French had enjoyed in the siege warfare of the previous days. It could result in a defeat that would undo all their gains. Joan and her companions attended Mass, and then the French army emerged from the city, forming up opposite the English lines. For about an hour, the two armies faced each other across the field. This was the moment that could have determined everything. If the battle had been fought, casualties on both sides would have been heavy, and the outcome was far from certain. But the battle never happened. The French, following the advice of their commanders and the wishes of Joan, who despite her aggressiveness was unwilling to attack on a Sunday without clearer provocation, held their position without advancing. The English, seeing that the French would not attack and recognizing the impossibility of maintaining their siege, began to withdraw. It was an anticlimactic end to the siege, but strategically, it was a complete French victory. The English abandoned their remaining bastilles, destroyed what supplies they couldn't carry, and marched away to the north. The siege of Orléans, which had lasted 7 months and seemed destined to end in English triumph, was broken in a week of intensive action. The city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, and the citizens poured into the streets in thanksgiving. Joan attended a service of thanksgiving at the cathedral, where she was hailed as the savior of the city. The military commanders, who had initially been skeptical of this peasant girl, now recognized that something extraordinary had happened. How was it possible? The numbers often cited for this campaign, that Joan's 3,000 soldiers defeated England's 25,000 Tours, are somewhat misleading and require examination. The English never concentrated 25,000 troops at Orléans. Their siege force was probably between 4,000 and 5,000 soldiers, distributed among the various bastilles. Additional English forces were in the region, but not directly engaged at Orléans. The French relief force was indeed around 3,000 to 4,000 troops, but when combined with the existing Orléans garrison, the total French force was probably somewhat larger than the English siege force. The real story is not simply one of numerical advantage, but of concentrated force, superior morale, tactical aggression, and the collapse of English psychological dominance. Several factors combined to make this dramatic reversal possible. First, Joan's impact on French morale cannot be overstated. Medieval armies lived or died by their belief in their cause and their confidence in victory. The French had suffered so many defeats that a culture of defeatism had taken root. Joan shattered this psychology with her absolute certainty, her claims of divine backing, and her willingness to place herself in danger. Soldiers who had been fighting defensively suddenly fought with the conviction that God was on their side. Second, the French strategy of attacking the isolated English bastilles one at a time was sound. The English had spread their forces in a ring of fortifications that could not easily support each other. By concentrating their forces against individual positions, the French achieved local superiority at each point of attack. The English inability or unwillingness to counterattack and relieve their embattled positions remains somewhat mysterious, but may reflect command uncertainty and the psychological impact of facing an enemy who had suddenly become aggressive and confident. Third, Joan's insistence on aggressive action, while it clashed with the professional commander's caution, proved strategically correct. Medieval sieges typically ground on for months or years, with both sides settling into defensive patterns. Joan's pressure for immediate, sustained offensive action gave the English no time to adjust or reinforce their positions. The campaign lasted only a week of intense action, during which the English were kept off balance. Fourth, the English themselves were not at their strongest. The siege had dragged on for months, supplies were becoming difficult, and the death of the original English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, who was killed by a cannon shot early in the siege, had left the English leadership divided and uncertain. The remaining commanders, while capable, lacked a unified strategy once their siege began to unravel. Fifth, technology played a role. The French made effective use of artillery during the assault on Les Tourelles, with cannon fire weakening the English defenses. The increasing importance of gunpowder weapons was beginning to change medieval warfare, favoring the offensive and making static fortifications more vulnerable. Finally, there was Joan herself, something unprecedented in medieval warfare. She was not trained in military tactics, yet her strategic instincts were often correct. She understood the importance of momentum and morale. She grasped that the English psychological dominance was as much their strength as their longbows or men-at-arms. By presenting herself as God's instrument and demonstrating courage by placing herself in the thick of combat, she created a narrative that the French could believe in and that sowed doubt among English ranks. The aftermath and Joan's fate. The relief of Orléans was only the beginning of Joan's military career, but it was the achievement that established her reputation and changed the trajectory of the war. In the weeks following the victory, she accompanied the French army in a campaign along the Loire Valley, clearing out English garrisons and winning a series of engagements that culminated in the French victory at the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429. Patay was a conventional battle, and the French triumph there, defeating an English force under Sir John Fastolf, demonstrated that Joan's impact went beyond the unusual circumstances of the siege. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded English armies was broken. French commanders and soldiers now believed they could win. Joan's great goal was accomplished on July 17, 1429, when Charles VII was crowned king at Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing nearby holding her banner. The coronation in the traditional site of French royal consecrations was a powerful statement of French legitimacy against English claims. Joan had fulfilled her mission as she understood it. Her subsequent military career was more mixed. An assault on Paris in September 1429 failed, and Joan was wounded. The French court, now more confident and less desperate, was less inclined to follow the Maid's aggressive strategies. Political considerations and the slow pace of medieval diplomacy took precedence over Joan's desire for continued military action. On May 23, 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces during a skirmish at Compiègne. The Burgundians sold her to their English allies, who were eager to put her on trial. If Joan was proven to be a heretic or witch, it would delegitimize her victories, and by extension Charles VII's coronation. Joan was tried by a French ecclesiastical court in Rouen under English control. The trial, which lasted from January to May 1431, was a tragic spectacle. Joan, without legal training or advisors, defended herself ably against learned theologians who were determined to find her guilty. They focused on her refusal to submit her claims of divine visions to church authority and her insistence on wearing male clothing. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace at Rouen. She was 19 years old. Her last words were reported to be, "Jesus, Jesus." Even some English soldiers were moved to tears, one saying he had burned a saint. But Joan's death could not undo what she had accomplished. The 100 Years' War continued for another 22 years, but the tide had turned permanently in France's favor. The English were gradually pushed back, losing territory until by 1453 they retained only Calais on French soil. Charles VII, whom Joan had helped crown, would reign until 1461 and oversee the consolidation of royal power in France. In 1456, a posthumous retrial ordered by Pope Calixtus III declared Joan innocent of all charges and proclaimed her a martyr. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Legacy and historical significance. The relief of Orléans and Joan of Arc's week of miraculous victories have resonated through history as one of the most dramatic military reversals ever recorded. The story has been told and retold, inspiring countless works of literature, art, and scholarship. But beyond the legend, What is the historical significance of these events? First, the relief of Orléans marked the turning point in the Hundred Years' War. Before Joan, France seemed destined for partition or outright conquest. After Orléans, French victory became inevitable, though it took decades to achieve. The psychological transformation was as important as any military victory. Joan gave the French the belief that they could win and a narrative of divine favor that countered English claims to the French throne. Second, Joan's campaign demonstrated the importance of morale and leadership in warfare. Military historians have long debated the relative importance of material factors, like numbers, equipment, and position, versus intangible factors like morale, leadership, and belief in one's cause. Joan's achievement is a powerful case study in how intangible factors can prove decisive. Her impact on French morale and English doubt was perhaps more important than any tactical decisions made during the campaign. Third, the events at Orléans showcase the unpredictable nature of history. By all reasonable assessment, Joan of Arc should have been dismissed as a religious fanatic and sent home. Instead, the desperation of the French situation created an opening for her to demonstrate her remarkable abilities. History is often shaped by individuals who emerge from unlikely circumstances to redirect the course of events in ways that seem, in retrospect, almost miraculous. Fourth, Joan's story has enduring power because it speaks to fundamental human experiences and aspirations. A young person without power or privilege, motivated by conviction, achieves something extraordinary despite overwhelming obstacles. Whether one believes her visions were genuine divine communication, psychological phenomena, or strategic brilliance disguised in religious language, her achievement remains extraordinary. Finally, the relief of Orléans reminds us that warfare is ultimately a human activity, subject to human psychology, emotion, and belief. The English did not lose at Orléans primarily because they were outnumbered or outflanked. They lost because they were confronted by an enemy who had rediscovered the will to fight, and because their own confidence was shaken by facing something they could not understand or easily counter. A teenage girl who seemed to embody divine will and who transformed demoralized soldiers into warriors willing to storm fortifications they had previously feared to approach. Conclusion. In 1 week in May 1429, Joan of Arc led French forces to break the siege of Orléans, achieving a victory that seemed impossible just days earlier. The campaign was not simply a matter of 3,000 French soldiers defeating 25,000 English troops, as the popular telling suggests. The numbers were more complex, the strategic situation more nuanced. But the essential truth remains. A small French force, inspired by an unlikely leader, achieved a dramatic victory over an English army that had dominated France for decades. Joan's impact came through a combination of factors: her effect on French morale, her insistence on aggressive action, the sound strategy of attacking isolated English positions, and the psychological blow her presence dealt to English confidence. She appeared at the precise moment when France needed not just soldiers or supplies, but belief in the possibility of victory. The relief of Orléans did not end the 100 Years' War, and Joan's own story would end tragically just 2 years later. But those 7 days in May changed everything. They transformed a losing war into a winnable one, turned a doubtful dauphin into a crowned king, and gave France a symbol of national identity that endures to this day. Joan of Arc's achievement at Orléans stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of how leadership, courage, and unwavering conviction can overcome material disadvantages and achieve results that seem, by any rational calculation, impossible. Whether guided by divine voices or extraordinary intuition, this teenage peasant girl changed the course of Western European history in a single week of inspired action. That is why, more than 600 years later, we still tell her story with wonder.